Some years ago, we got into the issue of campaign finance reform and worked very closely with Senators John McCain and Russ Feingold and Congressman Chris Shays and Marty Meehan. And it was really growing out of that work on campaign finance reform and also some earlier work that we had done on legal and regulatory reform that a number of the trustees at CED became very, very concerned about what was happening to state courts around the country. And I've said this before, and I really do believe it. I should say I'm a recovering lawyer who now works with economists and also attorneys. But I think that the issue that we're going to talk about today, the way in which judges are elected, selected, appointed, the way many of them have to raise money for their races, is an even bigger problem for this country than campaign finance reform. Approximately 40 states elect judges, and in those states, the judges who are running for election or re-election can raise money from, in a number of cases, the people, parties, and interests who appear before them. And as you will see this afternoon, some of these races have become very nasty. You'd think they were federal races for Congress or Senate or maybe even the presidency. But there's a difference, I think, between campaign finance reform as we tried to reform it in the federal system and what's happening in the states. With all due respect to members of Congress, no one expects them to be objective and independent. But with our judges, both Article III judges in the federal court and certainly in the states, judges are expected to be independent, objective, finders of fact, and appliers of the law. And if you get to a situation, which has actually happened in many of our states, where a state judiciary is perceived as being owned by either the plaintiff's bar or the defense bar, which in many instances means corporate America, we all lose. Let me just tell you one little anecdote which really put it in perspective. You have a copy of CED's report on judicial selection reform, Justice for Hire. The reason we picked that title goes back to the subcommittee meetings where our trustees convened to work through the findings and recommendations. One of the people on that subcommittee was a very prominent Texas plaintiff's attorney. And one of our former co-chairs called me up and said, "You got to get this fellow involved." And I said, "Why would we want a plaintiff's bar, prominent plaintiff's attorney, helping us figure out how to change the system?" And he said, "Because he understands it. He's played it, and he wants to change it." So at our first subcommittee meeting, this plaintiff's attorney from Texas said, towards the end of our discussion, he said, "Well, I want to tell you all what we have here in Texas." He said, "What we have in Texas is jukebox justice. You put your quarter in, you punch your little buttons, and your judge will sing your tune." True story. At our fourth and final meeting of our subcommittee, by the way, this fellow was a guest. He was not a CED trustee. In the last meeting, he said, "I just want to tell you all what I've done in Texas. In this current cycle, which I think was 2000-2002, I have personally contributed over $300,000 to judicial races in Texas." That's when I told him, "You need to become a CED trustee." And he did, because I said, "Your investment in CED will go a lot farther, I think, in terms of principled investment than what you're doing in Texas." And he's been a trustee of CED and actually working inside to change it. But these are real examples. One person, jukebox justice, $300,000. You buy your justice. Fortunately, that does not happen in the federal system. So that's why we got into it, because we think this system, as it evolves, is giving business a bad name. And it's undermining the objectivity and the integrity of a very, very precious aspect of American public life. So we are honored that all of you are here today. We have a distinguished panel, and certainly one of the most distinguished persons ever to serve on the American Supreme Court. So thank you, and we look forward to continuing this dialogue after today. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dean Paul Portney from the Eller College of Management here at the University of Arizona. And I think many of you know the dean. I'm not going to go through all of his bio. It's there for you, but from 1972 through June of 2005, he was with Resources for the Future, and actually, Paul, I think you ran it for 10 years. Is that correct? You were the president and CEO before coming here to Arizona. But I did, in doing a little research, I dug up an article about you from a very prominent columnist for the Washington Post. And when Paul stepped down from Resources for the Future to come here, Stephen Pearlstein, who last year won a Pulitzer, is a very, very well-regarded business columnist for the Post, wrote the following about Paul. Think tank leaders' principled wisdom will be missed. And let me just quote. For a time, he's talking about think tanks, public policy organizations in Washington. For a time, these were among the capital's most important intermediating institutions, providing the hard data and analytical framework for policymakers to prioritize issues, resolve the clash of interests, and overcome the special interests. But in today's, and this is 2005, but in today's hyper-partisan and ideological climate, many of these organizations have been co-opted, bullied, or forced to choose sides. One notable exception is Resources for the Future, which for more than 50 years has brought the rigor of economic analysis to the consideration of environmental issues. And then Steve goes on to talk about Paul's changing the way Resources for the Future worked. He'd been there for 33 years, president for 10. He showed, quote, not only a knack for identifying early on the issues and ideas that would one day take center stage, but also a facility in communicating research results in ways that made them useful to laymen. And while careful to avoid turning Resources for the Future into an advocacy group, he never shied away from using the facts to challenge business interests that reflexively opposed all regulation, or environmental groups that never met one they didn't like. Paul, that is a wonderful testament coming from one of the most well-regarded columnists for the Washington Post, and also a syndicated columnist. All I will say is that Arizona is very lucky to have you here, and we miss you very much in Washington. Paul, the floor is yours.